Hey, my name is Patric. I've been at ThoughtWorkers for about 4.5 years. I'm currently working for a large publisher on a Scala project as a tech lead.
I'm Liz Douglas. I've been with ThoughtWorkers for about 3.5 years and I'm one of the developers on Pat's team. So at the moment I'm particularly interested in Scala as a language. I've used it, this is my second Scala project, so I certainly enjoyed developing in it and I'd like to use Scala a lot more in lots of different projects.
I've mostly done Java development in the past, but I've been on some other projects as well, so I've done some C#, I've done quite a lot of Ruby in my spare time, and this is my first Scala project, and quite excited about that. So, I mean, in a nutshell, we're basically building a content distribution platform for a large publishing house. So it's basically, think of it, it's basically a web app talking a big database and serving content.
Right, so I think one of the biggest things about publishing is the size of the data. So they have a lot of data and obviously the content is enormous, so data is a big thing for them. So all of their data actually comes in XML format, and we're using a XML database, which is MarkLogic, and Scala has built-in support for XML, so that makes it a really compelling feature of the language. So we're using Scala, but it was an evaluation process that we went through at the start of the project, and it wasn't the only candidate. So specifically, the client had a requirement to use a JVM language. So Scala was an obvious option there, as was Groovy and Java.
So one of our stakeholders is quite technical himself, which helped because he was basically also interested in exploring, new languages, and so he, as Liz said, so he suggested Groovy, and then also Scala. We started looking into Groovy and then basically realized that the guy who originally wrote Groovy said that if Scala had existed at the time when he wrote Groovy, he would have never written it. So I think that was enough to convince our client that, to not go down that route. So it came down to mostly comparing Scala versus Java.
Yep.
So what are the benefits that Scala gives you versus Java, and what are the disadvantages? So that was the things. I mean, everybody was a bit nervous, before we started this project. We were really open with the client. We didn't pretend that we have Scala experience. Nobody on the team had any Scala experience. So we were looking for ways to kind of mitigate the risk, and one of these mitigation was the 4-week checkpoint, where we basically said we're going to decide whether we're going to start from scratch in Java or whether we're going to continue.
So some of the benefits that they were hoping to gain from this included being able to attract developers that were interested in learning and interested in modern languages. Or,
it was kind of one of our selling points for Scala was that, we think you're going to be a more attractive employer. And they started after some time they actually started using that as kind of a filtering mechanism in their interviews. So one of the lead developers here told me that, sometimes in an interview he would tell a candidate that we're using Scala, and some of them would get really excited and others would walk out almost. And it's probably the people who got excited, that's probably the people that you wanted to keep.
And I think they've certainly succeeded at that. They have hired probably about 6 developers.
Yeah.
Who are all, doing quite well as Scala developers now, which is really good to see. They do have experienced Java developers in-house as well. But they were also hoping to achieve things like, basically faster turnaround time.
We're hoping for increased developer productivity. Increased developer productivity because at the end of the day we think because some of the constructs that Scala offers you, you end up writing less code. Less code means less time to type things, which is probably not that important, but it also means less time that developers spend reading code, and it also means less lines of codes where basically bugs can hide.
And you get less code because you have things like higher order functions and the collections libraries. Probably a reason enough alone, I think, to choose Scala, just because it's just such a powerful part of the language. things like list and map, etc. And they have all more functions than you could possibly imagine. Things like filtering and flat mapping and folding and all these sorts of things. So things which are just extremely powerful, where you'd have to iterate over lots of different things if you were using a language like Java. You can just do it all in online and chain a few things together and process data very quickly, which is important for us. Things like the XML support. You can write XPath-like expressions, I guess, in Scala, and we've used that all over the app, particularly because all our data is in XML. So.
Probably one of the most powerful things that Scala offers. It's I think it's for one of, it's on the one hand side it's object-oriented, on the other side it's functional, and it kind of like allows you to get the best things of both worlds. It's not that Scala introduces new paradigms, but it's combining these two paradigms, and that's very powerful.
So I guess for people coming from a Java background, you can stick more in the object-oriented world, which is something that we've seen on a number of ThoughtWorks clients now. And people like Graham Tackley from The Guardian talks about a lot how they, we've seen it here as well. You start off sort of doing Java-like code, and over time it sort of matures into using more of the functional stuff as people develop new skills in those different areas.
Yeah, that was actually one of the things that I was really kind of like pleasantly surprised about in the beginning. To kind of like see how gentle the learning curve is if you're coming from a Java background, or even if you're coming from a probably like C# background. And it's very much like at the beginning of the project, I suppose we very much wrote Scala in the way we would have written Java. And kind of like as we started to get more comfortable with the language, we started to use like more of the Scala-esque features, and I think that worked out really well.
Yeah, so I actually did an exercise of going back in time and looking at the code base as it was at the very sort of after about 3 weeks or something of development, and then looking at it after 6 months. And it's interesting that you've actually rehashed everything, and it does feel quite different at that point. A lot of the more Java things are disappeared. Interestingly, we've had a number of new starts, so experienced Java people. And it's quite interesting seeing the stuff that they commit actually, because straight away it sort of strikes you, oh, this has got a different flavour, this looks like Java again. So it does mature over time. I think that's one thing that we have to manage. I think Pat's done a good job of managing how far, particularly down that functional path that we've gone, and we can talk more about features of the language that make this possible, and making those choices about where is my team at, and are we going to be the people maintaining it, and are we taking the developers with us when we're learning new things? So I think that's a really important thing. Yeah,
but I think generally speaking we have a quite consistent style across the code base, because it's not that we wrote one part of the system and then never touched it, and then like 3 months later, as we became more proficient in Scala, we wrote something completely different. So it was not an incremental process, but also an iterative process, so we would go over the same bit of the code base over and over again. And I think the other thing that also helps, so we're rotating a lot, so we're pairing and we rotate people a lot, so that really helps to kind of like establish, I suppose, a common style of programming.
Yeah.
So one other thing that we did at the beginning, because so we were kind of aware that Scala is a more powerful language than Java is, and there's potentially more, rope to hang yourself with. And so one thing that we did very early in the project was, when the team was still smaller, we had weekly code reviews, and in addition to that we also had like a weekly Scala time with one of our guys in India, Mushtaq, who's writing a chapter on Scala, so he's very knowledgeable about Scala. So we would ask, we would have like a 1.5 hour or so Skype session with him, and we'd ask him lots of questions. But also I think that the code review was really useful, because every time we kind of like introduced a new feature into the code base, a new language feature, we would start having a discussion, and so why are we starting to use that here, and why don't we use something different? I think initially it was the code reviews that was kind of like as a as a mechanism to make sure we don't go too crazy.
Yeah.
And anyways, like we also clearly communicated in the beginning, let's just take it easy, let's, even if you don't write the most consistent, concise code, even if it looks a bit Java-esque, let's try that first. And as we get more comfortable, let's move more towards, the more idiomatic ways of writing Scala. And I think that, so that was kind of like a mechanism where we, and we also in the code review sometimes we decided to, then not everybody felt comfortable with a feature and we decided to take something out. And I think now, as opposed to really pair programming and the rotating, that really helps because, if we are trying to get really clever in one area, chances are that somebody who's never seen this is probably going to, work on that code base, and, if they don't understand it, then that's probably a sign, we should probably change something.
That's true.
So we started using, I was actually still during Inception, we did some spikes, and we started using Play, which is quite popular in the Java community, and we had some good experience reports from Play from the Java community. So we looked into Play.
The Scala version of Play.
The Scala version of Play.
There was the option to use the Java version, but it made sense if there was a Scala version to evaluate them.
And then actually between the time when we evaluated it and when we actually started using it, which was only like about 2 weeks, they changed the version. They released a new version, and it pretty much broke all the spikes that we had previously done. And at that point, our code wouldn't compile anymore. We couldn't really get it to work in our IDE. At some point, we actually realized that the new version of Play shipped with its own Scala compiler. We found it really, really difficult to kind of change the build process and customize the build process, integrate it into our CI server, etc. So basically, after 2 days, we decided to ditch it, and we went for something much simpler, which is Scalatra, inspired by Sinatra from the Ruby community. And it's basically a very, very lightweight, web framework that pretty much gives you root matching and URL handling. That's almost it. So I think the jar file is like 200K. And when I was 6 months into the project, and we never really hit.
We haven't looked back.
We haven't looked back.
Yeah. Good. I think Lift is I guess the other obvious alternative, but I think that's probably a bit heavy weight perhaps for what we were looking for.
So we looked at Lift, and the reason why we didn't like Lift is we had the feeling it's kind of like it's trying to hide the web away, or it's trying to hide the fact that you're doing HTTP, and certainly so developers that looked at it at that point, were all quite comfortable with with HTTP requests and responses going over the wire, and we kind of feel like if that's taken away from us, we kind of lose a bit of control. So I think Scalatra has a different approach in that it really embraces the web and HTTP, and we like that much more.
Yeah. That said, though, I think there's lots of potential for things like Play. Play will be a really good. It's already a good framework in Java, and it will be a good framework in Scala, but it just hasn't matured enough yet, I don't think. Yes.
But I think with Play, it just felt like that the framework actually got in the way.
Yeah.
And it kind of felt, you can get something up and running really, really fast, but then as soon as you want to, basically if you don't want to play by Play's rules, you're on your own.
Yeah.
And it gets really hard. And I suppose it's probably a bit the same as in Rails, right? You can create Rails applications really fast, but as soon as you want to do something, that Rails wasn't kind of meant for, you're going through a world of pain.
Yeah, and you get the same thing in something like Django, don't you? Sort of that package sort of solution. Yeah.
And from that point of view, I think Scalatra is really nice because it just doesn't get in the way.
Yeah.
It's really lightweight. You have to do a bit more plumbing yourself.
Yeah.
But not much.
Yeah. So I think from the outset we also used SimpleBuild tool, which is sort of the Scala standard, I guess, for building.
Yeah.
And it is a really, really concise build tool. It's our build file does amazing things, and it's all in under 150 lines or something, so it's quite impressive that you write it in a Scala DSL, you build file, and in version 0.7 it was really easy to do that. And then we upgraded to version, what is it?
0.10.
0.10, and it's really got a much steeper learning curve. So that's one of the things that was really challenging. And while it's been very powerful, and I think it's the right choice of tool, there's a big learning curve now with using SimpleBuild tool. So
yeah. So I think what has happened to SimpleBuild tool from version 0.7 to 0.10, it got extremely functional.
yes.
And it just does lots of magic, and you know, you can still do pretty much everything you want with it, but
There's a barrier to entry there.
there's a barrier. There's
Yeah.
definitely a steep learning curve.
I'd be tempted to use it for a Java project. I think it's a little bit similar in some ways to the Builder project, which was sort of, I guess, preceded it by a couple of years, but it's got the same sort of feel, and that certainly can use for both Scala and Java, so yeah, I think you probably could use it for both.
I mean, in fact, it comes out of the box. It comes with support for compiling, you know, cross-compiling Java and Scala, so you wouldn't have to do an awful lot.
Yeah.
Whether I would choose it for a Java project, I'm not sure.
Yeah, potentially. Maybe I'm just so scarred by Ant and Maven that just look for something else. Yeah, that's true. The Scala test we're using
Yeah.
at all layers of testing, I guess, which makes it sort of a fairly exceptional tool, I think. So we use it for functional or acceptance style tests, which we couple it with WebDriver for that. We also use it for integration tests, particularly around the MarkLogic database integration. And we use it for unit tests, so we can write the same style of test and expectation, etc. at all layers, which I think is, I can't think of another tool which
No,
lets you do that.
I think it's great. I think it's great. Yes, it also made it possible to reuse abstractions.
Yes.
Like so for example, our integration tests and our functional tests, they're often navigating around the page, or they're doing things, and so it allowed us to reuse these abstractions across the different types of tests that we use.
Yeah. Yeah, that's been brilliant.
So we looked at a few different template languages, and so I personally quite liked string template, and we tried to use it, but just it didn't work. It didn't play well with Scala, because it relies a lot on having Java beans with getters, etc. etc. So that didn't work.
I guess the thing to like about string template though is that you don't have logic in templates. That's the main advantage, and I think for people, particularly people who are new to doing web development, that's something that you want to aim for, is to not have too much logic in your templates.
Yeah. So then after we can do, so yeah, we wanted a logicless template. We can do string template. So basically Scalatra already has some support for Scalate, which is Scala templating engine. Funny enough, written by the guy who originally wrote Groovy and now loves Scala, James Strachan.
Yeah.
So and Scalate is pretty cool, and it has support for different templating language dialects. So pretty much, I think one of the first ones was SSP, which is very similar to JSPs or Velocity. And then another dialect it has is Jade, which is similar to Hamel. So it's basically leaves off your angle brackets, and you don't have to put the closing tags. And then another one is Mustache, which is also it's been ported to a couple of different languages, including it's quite popular in JavaScript. So we originally started using Mustache because it's logicless. But at some point it didn't allow us to do certain things that we wanted to do. So one example was we wanted to so we have you can select multiple languages when you look at the web page, and so we wanted basically some helper functions that would allow you to translate a message key on your page, and we couldn't do that in Mustache. And there were also some other things, just like concatenating a bunch of strings with a separator. It just ended up being like really, really difficult. So in the end, after maybe 5 or 6 iterations, we ditched Mustache and we switched over to Jade. So the other thing is also Jade is actually compiled, whereas Mustache isn't, which is quite nice. So you kind of like, you know, if you have a typo, you actually get a proper error message and it says doesn't compile. Yeah, and I suppose so far it's working well.
Yeah, it's good. I think we have, you know, we talked about in our recent code reviews that we've probably strayed into putting more logic than we'd like now.
Yeah.
So we'll have to go back and sort of prune around the edges, but overall it's been good.
So what about IDE and tool support?
So I think the lack of IDE support, or the limited IDE support, is something that's quite well known in the community. So we use IntelliJ here, which is fine. It's adequate support, but it's not as good as what you would get with something like Java, for example. We actually do use like SBT, SimpleBuild tool from the command line. So we run all our builds and tests and everything just from the command line and not from within the IDE. So we're sort of used to working that way, and we can work quite productively, I think, that way. But it's not as nice as having everything, you know, all in one environment, I guess. That said, since I did my first project in Scala to the time to now, the tool support in the IDE has massively increased, so it is improving all the time. I think the official line is that Scala, they're working more actively on Eclipse and putting more effort into that. So at some stage I think we'd be open to switching over to Eclipse, if that made sense.
Yeah, so I would say, yeah, it's getting better, but it's nowhere near as,
yeah,
you know, nearly as polished as the Java tool support.
But I don't think it's so painful that you would say that that's a limiting feature in terms of choosing the language. It's just, okay, we have to go to the command line, but hey, we're okay with going to the command line, that's fine. So, yeah. In terms of tool support generally, I guess it is a less mature community, and lots of tools are still being ported over to Scala from Java, etc. So things like mocking frameworks like Mockito, there's some sort of edge cases around there where Mockito you can't do what you want in it yet. But it's just because it's a Java tool at the moment, so
yeah,
it's getting there, but it's going to take a bit of time. But I don't think we've had any horrors where we haven't been able to find an alternative which works.
No, and in fact, that's something I was really impressed about, was the integration between Java and Scala is really very seamless.
Right.
So that was actually one thing that I was concerned about in the beginning. I thought, well, you know, I'm sure we're not going to have, you know, not going to be able to reuse all the existing, you know, Java libraries. But that has turned out to be a non-issue. The other thing is the Scala compiler is still very slow. It's about an order of magnitude slower than the Java compiler. And we talked to one of the guys from TypeSafe, and he said he would be very surprised if it gets more than 50% faster than it is at the moment, which would still make it 5 times slower than the current Java compiler.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, it's slower.
Slower.
I think we don't really notice it so much yet. Yeah. It's probably not enough of a barrier that you would say, okay, let's not use the language because that's a problem.
But then the other nice thing is also that once you've compiled, you're basically, you know, you're in JVM land.
Yeah. And
you basically have all the tools at your disposition that you have in, you know, on a normal Java or JVM project.
Yeah.
So that means, you know, if you need to profile something, you know, it's just bytecode, so you use your standard Java profilers. Yeah. You might get the occasional, you know, like strange anonymous inner clause or that kind of stuff, which is just kind of like, you know, an artifact of compiling down from Scala to Java. But that's no different than, you know, profiling some C# code that has link in it.
That's true.
So
and
that's
that has
nice.
The advantage for DevOps people as well, because they can just treat it like it's just a Java project. Yeah. They don't need to care. So yeah, that's good. So what would you tell clients considering Scala?
So I would definitely consider it. Get the team involved, see how people feel about it. You know, see if they're comfortable learning a new language. So I wouldn't just like unconditionally recommend Scala on every team for every project. Did a retrospective on Scala a few weeks ago, and we asked the entire team, ThoughtWorkers and client developers, so what they thought about Scala, and I think nobody would have wanted to go back and start the project in Java, which was like a very, very positive takeaway from that retrospective. Was they liked the fact that there's less code to write. They like the fact that they have, they can use functional programming. They like the fact that you can write DSLs very easily, which is what we've done also ourselves for the testing.
For us, the XML support is particularly important to learn new things.
Learn things.
Yeah.
They like the integration with Java, with all the Java libraries.
Yeah.
I don't think we had a dip. I think we had a slightly less steep ramp up, probably.
I think we had a Java ramp up.
But yeah, I mean that was I think that was one of the surprising things, that like nothing bad ever happened. I mean I was often waiting, like for something, to go wrong, but like I think we've probably also just been lucky. I mean, as I said, we did some things to mitigate the risks, but I think we're probably also a bit lucky.
Yeah.
But no, we never really had a dip, and it's kind of like it's one of these impossible things to compare this team, to another team, because I mean, to do a fair comparison, you would have to have exactly the same team, exactly the same context, doing a Java project.
Yeah. You can start off by writing Java style code, and it's that simple, and that's your first step, and then you're starting to learn new features about Scala, and it might take sometimes a longer time, and it might take sometimes a very short time. But I think you avoid the dip if you're just doing sort of what you've always done initially, and then starting to gradually, as your team gets more used to the concepts and more used to language, you can start to building more of it. So I think that's probably for me the most compelling thing. If I was a dev manager, I'd be saying, there's not really a downside to making the switch. You just make the switch and then let people, or nudge people, or have some sort of target where they can get to in a certain period of time. But it's not like you have to, it's not a hard switch over. You can fall back. It's interesting to think about. In some ways, even though you do have the comfort of being in a JVM language and still being able to use a lot of the same patterns and tools, etc., you do have slightly different coding patterns, particularly with things like traits and pattern matching and some other features of the language, which mean that you can, there is an element of relearning how to write good code, and I'm not sure that the community has really settled on this is what good code in Scala looks like yet. That will come, but I think we're a little bit a ways away from that yet.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like, in a way, nobody has written effective Scala yet.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And so there's still a lot of debate about there's still a lot of patterns who are yet have to emerge.
That's really exciting to be part of that, though. Like, to be able to form new patterns and. Yeah.
But yeah, but I suppose in a way it's kind of like so if you move into a new language, right, as I said earlier, so it's not new paradigms. So it doesn't mean like we're moving into a new language and now all of a sudden it's okay to have duplication, or it's okay to break encapsulation and all these things. It's maybe sometimes a bit harder because you're in a new context and things don't look as familiar to you as they would have looked to you in Java. And maybe in Java sometimes you did things just because that's how you've always done them, but actually the reason for doing them was driven by principles.
Right.
So I think in Scala I find myself like having to think much more of the principles. But then often, of course, it's not just black and white. There's often like lots of shades of grey, and I think there's where the community also has to decide. Okay, it's trade-offs. So which one do we choose, and which route do we go down to?
Yeah.
And we had especially around traits, for example.
Yes. Yeah.
I feel the language is kind of like, I think the language has been around for long enough, and I think there's enough of I think the community has enough momentum,
Right.
you know, for this language to be used on commercial projects and, you know, in the enterprise. Because even if you use Java, you know, I mean, there's always some risk. If we start on a Java project today, who can guarantee me that, you know, people will still be writing, you know, still be like actively supporting Java in 2 years, right? Maybe it will have moved away. Same thing with, you know, you can't tell. But I think at the moment there's enough momentum in the community.
Yeah, and I think it has cut its teeth in lots of ways. So I think it's no longer that you're sort of, you know, leading the pack if you're choosing to use Scala. There's enough projects out there. ThoughtWorkers has worked on, I think, 5 or 6 Scala projects now. So we have seen that it is being adopted quite widely. So I think that probably, you know, should allay some people's minds, I guess. And as you mentioned, there is a stronger community out there. So perhaps even if you don't have experience in your group, you can certainly source that, and you could answer some of these questions around the things that we're playing with. And I guess the main benefit would be that even if you don't exploit the features of the language, like traits and pattern matching, etc., you could stay in a fairly safe Java-style code base, but actually be using Scala and give yourself at least the option to start using those things once they become more talked about or more, you know, concrete, I guess, in how they should be used. So I think it's, you know, it shouldn't be a barrier, just because you can still stay in that safety net, just under a different umbrella.
Yeah.